Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Joining me today is an important guest, Cameron Hudson. Cameron is currently a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Among many of his affiliations and work, Cameron has previously also served as chief of staff for a successive presidential special envoy for Sudan between the period 2009 and 2012. Cameron, I had a problem, writing down all of the stuff you've done. They're quite long list. You have a very impressive resume. I'm pleased to have you join us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me to come on.
Okay, brilliant. We'll just go straight to it. So we've seen an intensification in the fight in Sudan between the two rival factions. But before we come to that, Sudan is like a very special case. It's got a history of conflict, long history of conflict, different kind of conflict. For those listeners that are unfamiliar with this particular country, can you just give like a historical background of the conflict situations in Sudan?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think for me, my entry point into thinking about the conflicts in Sudan is really sort of based on Sudan's geography, right? And so the current shape and size of Sudan is actually rather new, right? Since in 2011 you had South Sudan separate. So I think when you're asking a kind of historical question, it is worth remembering that South Sudan used to be an integral part of Sudan. And so when we think about that history, Sudan was the largest country in Africa for most of its history. It bordered, I think, 9 countries for most of its history. So that's changed a little bit in the last decade or so. But I think when you go beyond just the size of the country, you also have to think about where it sits on the African continent and the divisions in the country as part of a broader division within Africa, the sort of meeting of the Arab and the African world, right? And I think that is one of the things that makes Sudan, I think, very unique, very vibrant, but also has been at the root of a lot of its internal division, right? Is that that diversity has not been a source of strength, I guess would be a charitable way to say it. So you have a huge diversity of tribe and of ethnicity and religion within the country. And that has, I think that has largely been at the root of a lot of the problems. Traditionally, you've had a kind of Arab ruling class If you look at the map again of Sudan, and you talk to some of the kind of elites in the country, people are very quick to let you know that there are more Egyptian pyramids in Sudan than there are in Egypt, right? And that the in the time of the pharaohs, Sudan was really the center point and the centerpiece of early Egyptian history. And so you have this kind of chauvinism among, I think, certain Arab elites in the country who view themselves as descended from this sort of rich Egyptian pharaoh history, and and you have seen them act towards African tribes and minority tribes in the country with this kind of chauvinism at heart. And I think that was obviously the most pronounced and lasted the longest with respect to the conflict towards the south of the country, what is now South Sudan, right? And so that was a conflict that in two separate incidents, took place over more than 20 years, cost more than 2 million lives, and was a really brutal war that was divided along ethnic lines, tribal lines, regional lines, religious lines, you name it. And until obviously the independence of South Sudan, or the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, and the subsequent independence of South Sudan. And so Sudan, however, I think knew very little continuous peace, however, because in the time that in the late 90s, early 2000s, when there were serious regional and international efforts to try to resolve the conflict between North and South, we saw in the early 2000s a new outbreak of violence in the Darfur region, the far western region of the country. A lot of people have argued, I think somewhat convincingly, that Darfur is much more of a Sahelian state, having characteristics of Chad and Niger and also in terms of tribes, in terms of economy, in terms of obviously climate. Much more related to those regions further to the west than to the capital in Khartoum at all, right? And so you saw this uprising in Darfur. Some would argue that uprising was in fact stoked by the impending peace deal that the Southerners were going to get, and the Darfuris, who felt similarly marginalized, as I think all peripheral communities in Sudan had felt at some point, thought that it was an opportune moment to try to improve their situation internally, and revolt in an attempt to gain greater autonomy or wealth sharing from the government. That obviously didn't go in the same way that it did for the South Sudanese, and there was a brutal response by the central government in Khartoum. I think primarily because they saw the writing on the wall, which was if they made another peace deal like the one they made with South Sudan, then all of these peripheral areas of the country, which had been, marginalized considerably by the center since independence, were all going to kind of rise up and look for their own autonomy. And so they needed to nip that in the bud, and they did it through this very, very brutal what is now called a genocide against African tribes, mostly African tribes in the Darfur region. So that conflict never fully ended. It subsided and abated, but it never, there's no peace agreement, there's no peace deal, there's no, document that was ever signed that ended it. There was certainly no accountability. There were no trials held for the crimes that were committed. It sort of faded away a little bit, certainly from the public consciousness, even though the effects for the Darfuris lingered on considerably. But but that led to the sort of 2018, 2019 popular uprising, which, unlike previous uprisings, did not necessarily take place only in Khartoum. Actually, it didn't even start in Khartoum. It started in these more peripheral areas of the country. And I think there it was an uprising in response to, I think, decades of mistreatment, decades of deprivation by the central state. Economics at the heart of it, but frankly, I think very difficult to separate out the economic deprivation from the political and social and developmental deprivation. And again, this kind of chauvinism or racism that kind of was an undercurrent to all of Sudanese politics for generations. So that very, I think, promising and hopeful popular uprising by the people in 2018, 2019 led to the security services essentially jettisoning President Omar al-Bashir, who came into power in 1989 in an Islamist coup, essentially removing him from power, not because they were siding with the popular uprising or with the people, but I think they did it as a means of saving themselves and to saving the regime that they were a part of. And so you saw Bashir's removal in April of 2019. That did not quiet the protesters down. The protesters wanted just a change of leadership. They wanted a true change of regime, which was to say a change of the kind of military Islamist regime that Bashir had constructed over his more than 2 decades in power. And the security services were clearly not willing to do that. And so you saw a period of where the international community once again intervened, forced a kind of power sharing deal between civilian leaders and the security services. That power sharing deal lasted for about 2 years before it broke down, and the military and the security services stepped forward with a coup, removing the transitional prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok, and the two military arms or security arms of the state, the Rapid Support Forces, a militia group created by the army to fight the war in Darfur, and then, of course, the Sudan Armed Forces, the traditional army in the country. Essentially, those two leaders ruling with some discomfort between them until in April of last year, 2023, you saw the tension between those two leaders, break out into the open and unleash this really brutal, what is now, I guess, a civil war. With these two generals that is, left Sudan in this kind of renewed state of conflict. Although I would say this conflict has no similarity to any previous conflict that the country has ever experienced. The fact that it has started and been centered around the capital, Khartoum, the most populous country or most popular city in the country, is a substantially changed dynamic. I think for most of the country's history, even though there has been violence and instability, most of that, the majority of that, has been far from the capital, far from the eyes of the capital population. It was something that I think many in the capital, business elites, political elites, could largely ignore. The international community didn't ignore it, but elites in the country were able to largely ignore these tensions and violence that was going on in the peripheral areas. That's obviously not the case here. The conflict started in Khartoum and has since radiated out to virtually all portions of the country, save for some amount of the country in the north and some amount in the east. But other than that, most of the country has been touched in some way directly by this conflict now.
Amazing. What I'm getting from your very comprehensive responses, to some extent, that there seems to be a continuation from the past, because you did say those conflicts never ended. They were never resolved. There was no justice. There was no accountability. But it looks like it's gone from the problem has magnified to the point where it's gone beyond that now to something else, where we're seeing conflicts not at the periphery but at the center. So what is responsible for this shift, where we're seeing concentration of forces and fights in the center? What has changed?
Well, I think what's changed in some respects is the belligerence. I think for the listen, I mean the South Sudanese, when they held their long civil war, they they were never in that conflict ever able to inflict the kind of harm on the country that we have seen the rapid support forces do. They, as much as they were able to hold on in a long civil war and survive, that North-South Civil War, by and large, took place not in Sudan but in South Sudan. Right? It
Hmm.
was besieged cities of South Sudan, which for decades suffered. But the population in Khartoum and frankly all northern cities were untouched by that long war, because the SPLA, the Sudanese breakaway regime, it never had the
Hmm.
power to project its force beyond its own borders, and so it
Hmm.
was, it could push back within its borders, but it was never able to really strike at the heart of the North. That's very much not the case in this current conflict. I think what we
Hmm.
have seen is the Sudan army also over this time really atrophy. I think it is fair to say that
Hmm.
the kind of rot and corruption of state institutions um,
Hmm.
has uh, has plagued the Sudan army, just as it's plagued other institutions in the country. And so now that
Hmm.
it is facing this really formidable threat, it is seeing just how weak an institution it is, and
Hmm.
just how much in the course of the last, I would say, 10 or 20 years, the army has not actually done a lot of its own fighting. Even in the South Sudan conflict, the army created local militia groups, Islamist militia groups in South Sudan. They were called the Popular Defense Forces,
Hmm.
do its kind of fighting for it. So the army over time developed a kind of strength around its air force, and relied very heavily on its air force and to some extent artillery. But the
Hmm.
army, lost a lot of its ability to be mobile, lost a lot of its ability to be agile. And so you
Hmm.
see, even in the conflict with South Sudan, these kind of garrison cities that the army is able to maintain a garrison base, and launch
Hmm.
artillery or launch, long range bombing missions to weaken the enemy. That is not working with the rapid support forces. The rapid support
Hmm.
forces were a militia known previously as the Janjaweed, again created by the
Hmm.
military to carry out this kind of scorched earth campaign in Darfur, because it was not something that the Sudan armed forces was equipped to do. It didn't have the mobility, it didn't have the equipment, it didn't have the training to commit that kind of to those kind of tactics on the battlefield. And so
Hmm.
now, I think, in a kind of turn of irony, you have this creation, this monster that the
Hmm.
SAF has created, using its advantages, its tactical advantages, against the military now. And we have
Hmm.
seen that in the past 10 months, the military has really struggled to counter the mobility of the rapid support forces, and we're seeing it not able to use its strengths of defending garrisons and using air support to be able to overwhelm the enemy. It's the same tactics that they've used in South Sudan are no longer as effective against the current RSF threat.
Is this in any way related to, I think I've seen, I don't know if this is kind of related to similar tactics by military strongmen, even in other countries where we've seen where some have argued that these military strongmen, like Omar Bashir, they deliberately weaken the military capability by empowering and creating this militia or this private private police or military police to protect regime security. Is that a similar? Is that something similar? Did they create this monster that then become a threat to the regime itself?
Well, I think that the way it's often viewed in Sudan is the Bashir government, as it lost its ideological underpinning within the kind of Islamist movement, as it became kind of more and more corrupt, both ideologically corrupt and financially corrupt. It relied more and more on internal security forces to maintain its hold on power. And Bashir, I think, was rightly paranoid of the potential for a coup that would unseat him. Obviously, a guy who comes to power through a coup should probably also be worried about being ejected from power from a coup. And so he took a number of steps in his later years to, I think, what some would say would be to coup-proof his regime. And so you saw not only a kind of hollowing out of the army intentionally, but also the building up of things like the National Intelligence and Security Service, the kind of the intelligence arm of the country, which were given broad powers of arrest and detainment and search and seizure. And built up almost as a private army. You see similar building up of military intelligence, which was carved out from the SAF as its own kind of freestanding unit. And then you see also the formation of these kind of ad hoc militia groups throughout the country. So the idea here was that he was not going to have one single security force that was going to be so powerful that at the end of the day, it would be able to overthrow him and overthrow or counter any of the other security forces. So it was always this idea of keeping these various security forces off balance, or maybe even in balance, so that none was the hegemon within the country, and none could single-handedly remove him from power. So then that was the idea. Obviously, the problem with that was that it created this kind of multi-headed beast that became very unwieldy, very difficult to control. And you're seeing now that without proper discipline, you hollow out and diffuse power across these services. But when someone like a General Hemeti in the Rapid Support Forces is able to then, leverage, use his own leadership, use his own external relationships to transform the RSF, not into just this kind of ragtag militia, but into what is essentially the strength and size of a conventional army, you run into the problem that Sudan now faces, where you have essentially two national armies fighting out over one country.
There's always been focus on the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces, but there are other actors like the several militia groups that are aligned to each of these forces. How does that play into either prolonging or intensifying? How does these militia groups, different rebel groups that align with either the government forces or the RSF, what is that dynamics? Can you explain the dynamics there?
Well, I think, again, for the army, because they don't have a great deal of mobility built into how they've been, they've been taught almost in a kind of very 20th century way of fighting, right? They use artillery, they use tanks, they have a kind of modest air force, but they don't have the tactical wherewithal to really fight an effective counterinsurgency. And whether it was the South Sudanese or the Darfuris before, those were much more classical insurgency campaigns. And rather than building up the capacity to fight those forces themselves, they recruited militias to do it for them, right? And so, there is a long history of militias being formed. I think largely it comes from kind of self-defense communities that have always been in existence within many of the certainly nomadic tribes across the region, right? And so by organizing those groups and giving them just modest instruction and modest support, they were able to kind of weaponize these groups. What we're seeing now, and of course the RSF is learning to do the same, even though it's a product of having been formed. It is now going back into specifically into Darfur, but even beyond, we're seeing recruitment by the RSF from African tribes in Niger, in Chad, across the Sahel, being drawn in largely for a paycheck, but appealing to those groups along tribal lines. And so what you're seeing is, I think, these groups relying once again on tribally based militias. There's one new component to the war that's, I think, really starting to emerge now, and that is this idea of citizen self-defense. We're starting to see it mostly in areas held by the government of Sudan, still the military of Sudan. Because you have seen the RSF going into places, particularly in the south and the east of Sudan, and really committing awful, sort of human rights abuses and crimes in areas of the country that have never experienced those kinds of crimes before, you're seeing the formation of self-defense groups, not along necessarily tribal or ethnic lines, but built around cities to defend those cities. You're also seeing the military, as it has, suffered in this war, doing nationwide, call outs for recruitment. And so you're seeing average citizens again join up for the military. Again, I would say that traditionally, recruits to at least the officer class of the military have always been among a kind of elite Arab class, mostly from the north of the country, and the kind of infantry class were often kind of ethnic minorities from the peripheral areas. And so now you're seeing a much more kind of broad-based recruitment of forces to join the army now. So you're seeing citizen involvement in a way in their own defense and in defense of the state in a way that we haven't seen before in previous conflicts.
That is quite bleak. But I wanted to focus on some external involvement in this and the role they play. So I think where to start with is to look at we could look at the regional level, but I wanted to start from the external, from international level. Let's say Wagner Group, for instance, the Russian group. There's been cases where they say they've been providing support to the RSF forces, and they've had different groups, maybe Iran, providing support to the Sudanese armed forces. What is the role of this external support in terms of the conflict? And what is the driving force behind this support for each of these groups?
Sure. So I think the external support has been much more significant on the RSF side than it has been on the SAF side. I think that the RSF, by the nature of General Hemeti himself, General Hemeti, is worth recalling, he really transformed this Janjaweed militia into this RSF army. You know, he used the kind of the down period after the fighting in Darfur sort of subsided, as I was talking about in the early 2010s, to turn the RSF into a true militia force. And so he developed external ties across the Gulf, across North Africa. He was hired in Libya, hired in Yemen, developed his own kind of relationships with external backers during that period of time. Bashir was happy to have him do it because it allowed him to not worry about the RSF. They were outside the country fighting other people's wars. And I think that was probably a near-term strategy without a good look at what the long-term consequence was. The long-term consequences is that the RSF became very powerful, became very wealthy, became highly skilled at this kind of warfare that it's practicing now, and developed its own network of foreign backers that it has been able to call on, whether it's the Libyans or the Emiratis or other militia groups located in Chad and in Central African Republic. So it has used all of those connections mostly for arming itself and resupplying itself. But again, as I mentioned before, it's also used some of those tribal ties for recruitment from militia groups outside the country, whether that's in Central African Republic, Chad, Niger. It has recruited very heavily from outside of Sudan. So I think that's one way that the RSF, and you mentioned the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group was in Sudan even prior to the war breaking out. They had provided some, I think, security assistance, mostly at a technical level. But clearly, they have taken on a more strategic role for the RSF. We know, for example, that they have facilitated the sale of shoulder-fired missiles that have been brought from Wagner stockpiles in Central African Republic, bringing them into Sudan for the RSF to use. We don't know fully what the nature of the of any RSF operatives are, any soldiers are. They're reported to be fewer than 100 of them in the country. My suspicion is that Wagner is much more focused on maintaining the gold shipments out of the country, which it has been exploiting with the RSF for a number of years now, and I suspect that that's really its primary focus, given the stresses on Russia, financially in other areas. So it's hard to know exactly what the full operational nature of the relationship is, but they're certainly there, and we know that they have played a key role in, for example, the weapons trade. On the SAF side, it's kind of interesting that you haven't seen nearly as much external support to the SAF. People talk about the Egyptians providing support, and I think early on in the conflict, they provided some light air support, but that has not been sustained in any kind of significant way. I think Egypt is suffering economically right now. It was going through an election at the time. Its economy is in dire straits. It doesn't have the money to fight another war. Most of its debt is owned by the United Arab Emirates. And we know that the UAE has put pressure on Egypt not to become involved militarily in the conflict in Sudan. So you're not, even though people say, oh, well, the Egyptians are backing the SAF, they might be backing them from a moral perspective, but I don't think that they're doing very much from an operational perspective to back the SAF. People say the same thing about the Saudis, but again, I think the same holds true, that the Saudis, they may have a slight preference for the SAF. I don't know. But there's no evidence on the ground that they are providing any kind of sizable support to them. I think where the SAF has, drawn some attention in recent weeks is their outreach to Iran. And again, I think that clearly there's been an arms deal signed with the Iranians, I think around drones, but could also be around ammunition and other light weapons. But the fact is I think that certainly the way I read the outreach to Iran is, sort of proving my earlier point, which is because they're not getting any other external support, they have few options left if they want access to more advanced weaponry than to go to Iran. I don't think that Iran was their first choice to go to. Given the kind of international concern that would generate. But I think it's just a function of the fact that they're not getting sizable support from any other outside sources, that they had no other choice but to go to Iran.
How do you see this playing out? Because we've seen where, like you've rightly pointed out, the Sudanese armed forces have suffered some setback. So how do you see? And then we've also seen attempts at peace deals, peace talks, and Hemeti and Abdel Fattah coming together face to face at one point. But there's been some. So how do you see this playing out in the long run?
Well, that's a really hard question to answer. I think viewed from inside the conflict and the two leaders, I don't think that, despite what they say, I don't think there's much interest in stopping the fighting. I think that both sides are convinced and have been convinced from day one that they are in an existential conflict, and that they can't survive politically or even physically if the other side wins. And so despite them saying that they're open to talks or even going to Jeddah at one point and signing or committing to ceasefires, I don't think either side has any interest in a ceasefire. Now, that doesn't mean we won't get there eventually, but I think the problem with that is that to get there, if it's not going to be driven by the belligerents themselves, it has to be driven by the international community. And here, I would say the international community has completely failed the people of Sudan in responding to this conflict. You've seen a very half-hearted attempt between Washington and Riyadh to try to convene some initial talks. Those did not go particularly well or particularly far. The AU, the African Union, and the regional group IGAD have basically been kind of tripping over themselves in an almost comical way, but not really being able to contribute anything in terms of leverage over the parties. You have the UN, again, occasionally speaking out. There's a new UN special representative who's been appointed on Sudan about a month or two ago. But again, no serious initiative from the UN. Security Council has been basically mute on this conflict since the beginning. And so, if there's not a demand internally for a ceasefire, if there's not exhaustion from the parties who need a ceasefire, and if there's no kind of coordinated international effort to get us to a ceasefire or to some longer term political arrangement, then I think at least in the sort of close to medium term, my suspicion is that this fighting is gonna drag on. So I think that's that's the unfortunate outlook for the time being. We will see. Something has to change though. And I'm not sure what it is. If it's a change of battlefield control, if it's the SAF regaining or losing key portions of the country, but I think that the battlefield situation will do a lot to determine what the negotiating outlook is.
I'm happy you mentioned the failure of international community. Is that, can we relate that to the lack of, currently we look at the lack of moral moral vacuum in terms of what international body has that neutrality or has that ability to see what's going on with maybe in Israel, and look, we're seeing Israel, Hamas, we see in Ukraine. Do you think some of these conflicts are capitalizing on that what I call, maybe for lack of what to say, maybe hypocrisy among some of the traditional international, maybe in terms of democracy, maybe the United States, for instance, maybe does they embolden these fighters or these groups in Africa to then carry on and say, we don't have any strong international partner that's going to enforce such ceasefire or such negotiation?
Well, I don't know that it has emboldened the parties to this conflict. I think they would have been fighting anyway. Um, but I do think that the fact that you have seen a retrenchment of certainly the United States, which has been, for good or for bad, it has been the principal diplomatic actor in Sudan for 20 or 30 years now. The fact that it's given up that role essentially, I think, is a factor here. Again, even when the war in Darfur was going on 15 years ago, I always remind people that as much as Washington was paying a lot of attention to that conflict, Washington was also fighting a war in Iraq. It was fighting a war in Afghanistan. And so I kind of reject this argument that there's too much other stuff going on in the world for the West to care, because of Gaza or because of Ukraine. Yes, that's true. Those are big conflicts that are taking up our attention. But the United States had 400,000 American service members deployed in 2 different countries fighting a war, in addition to a global war on terrorism. And we can argue whether that was good or bad, or what the effect of that was, but the fact is that took up a lot of time and attention, not just from Washington's perspective, but from the kind of the Western alliance perspective, who were also engaged in those conflicts with us. And yet we were all able to dedicate time and attention and concern to the conflict in Darfur. And so the fact that we have, I would say, smaller conflicts going on today where there's absolutely no Western service members deployed. We don't have military who are dying on the front lines in Gaza or in Ukraine today, right? And yet we're using those as an excuse for why we can't get involved in Sudan today. And I just don't think that holds up, right? I think that what you're seeing, however, is this retrenchment from the West since those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? You've seen Washington step back from the traditional role that it has tried to play. Europe is obviously, I think, only concerned about the potential for migration from this conflict, and not necessarily in trying to solve it. And you have seen, in the same period of time, you have seen the rise of what we call the middle powers, right? The Turkey, South Korea, UAE, and you've also seen a resurgence of Russia and China. And so I think the fact of the matter is that whereas even just a decade ago, Washington or Brussels had a lot to do and say about how these conflicts were resolved, there's now a huge competition and a huge choice that countries have in terms of building diplomatic alliances, right? And so you have seen all of these other countries playing a role in the conflict in Sudan in a way that even a decade ago they were completely absent.
Yeah. I was looking at, if I look at a more continental, what lessons, looking at the Sahel, looking at Niger, Burkina Faso, and looking at Mali, and looking at the popular uprising in these places and the anti-Western narratives, anti-French narratives in those. What lessons does that present to these places? The lessons, because we started off from 2018 and the popular uprising against Bashar, and then what lessons does the Sudan present to these places in the Sahel where you currently have coup leaders in there?
Well, that's a great question. That's a hard question. I think Washington is really grappling with this question of, as I was just saying, about the rise of these middle powers and the rise of what maybe we should just be calling, alternatives to U.S. peacemaking and interventionism. What Washington is struggling with in the Sahel right now is this notion that, okay, well, traditionally, if you have a coup, then we isolate you, we sanction you, we punish you, right? Because we want to send a signal not just to those coup makers in that country, but to all of the other potential coup makers across the region, that there are consequences that you suffer when you commit these unconstitutional acts. Right? That has been the traditional playbook, and we've seen that playbook in Sudan. I mean, I think Sudan probably suffered the longest, most complete period of Western sanction and isolation and punishment under Bashir, right? And I think people in Washington now and more broadly are asking, well, what did that get us? What did the 20 years of sanctions and isolation? What did it really get us? What did it get? The regime survived. It wasn't overthrown because of our sanctions. It was overthrown because of a popular uprising. We really punished those people for 20 years in Sudan or more. So what did that regime of sanctions and isolation really achieve? I think people are asking that question now in the Sahel, because these countries that might face punishment for their coups, they now have alternatives. They can very quickly break their isolation through their relationships with China, with Russia, with Turkey, with a host of other countries who are more than happy to fill the vacuum that is being left by Washington or Brussels or London withdrawing, or Paris withdrawing from these places. And so I think that Washington has to learn from all of these lessons and really figure out a way that it can, be true to the values that it continues to espouse, the values of democracy and constitutionalism. How do you stay committed to those values, but at the same time not abandon these countries to forces who have no interest in democracy or prosperity, or even in the case of Russia, stability necessarily, right? And so it has I think a very difficult balancing act that it's going to have to figure out between how it pursues those long stated values and how it reconciles that with its interests in maintaining a presence, remaining in dialogue, and keeping open the door for being able to guide these countries back to a place where they are more stable, where they are more prosperous, and where stability in the region is regained.
I'll come to the last question, and I think I've asked you the prospect of the fund, and we've seen in the short medium term, it looks like it's going to continue, until there's a kind of like, maybe there's a field, a change in terms of like the combat. But then we've also talked about the receding role that Washington and what the Western alliances are playing. But you did mention briefly IGAD and the regional stuff, the AU and stuff. And from what I've read, I think they've had a bit more success when it comes to like trying to resolve the situation compared to Saudi Arabia and the US stuff. Do you think that is so I think there's a double question in terms of the regional spillover. Maybe we include Ethiopia in this now, because I've heard Ethiopia seems to have like maybe support towards the Sudanese army. Do you think, what is the implication in terms of like the spillover to the Horn of Africa, and then what prospect does IGAD and the AU have in taking the lead in resolving these issues? I think we can stop on this note, on this question.
Well, I think where we're going to see the spillover immediately, and where we're already seeing it, is in the refugee situation, right? You're saying, you've seen more than 1 million Sudanese have fled the country. I think in this year you could see some multiple of that number continue, given the humanitarian situation, given that nearly half the country is nearing a famine state right now in Sudan. Their only alternative is going to be to flee. And 1 million people is a lot of people, but it's spread over, 5 or 6 countries. It's spread, over all the neighboring states. If you were to see really a much larger exodus than that, I think you would necessarily see the region become much more involved, because all of a sudden it's going to affect them in ways that it needs to protect against. So right now, the largest number of refugees is in Chad, and they are in a very remote area of Chad along the border, where there's traditionally always been a lot of refugees, and where the humanitarian response is really really built in to those areas. So the refugee outflow has not yet had an enormous effect, but it could have an enormous effect on a country like South Sudan, right, which is already highly fragile and unstable. It could have a large effect on Ethiopia and Eritrea, where there's tensions along those borders already. And so if you really start to see much more sizable numbers of refugees, I think you're going to see the neighbors, which have largely remained on the outside of this conflict. You have not seen Ethiopia, Egypt really playing a decisive role. They've done some things on the margins, but really, I think they've been very careful not to inflame the situation. I think that could be reversed. I think that could change if you start to see the humanitarian effects, or even the military effects. If you see people trying to use foreign territory for basing or resupply or things like that, I really think that the region could become much more involved, and there's a real risk of that going forward. So I think IGAD is not fit for purpose today. I think IGAD is broken as an institution. I think that because Ethiopia has had the internal conflict that it has had, and has stepped back from its own leadership role. I mean, let's not forget, Sudan is the chairman of IGAD, right? I mean, it had been the chairman of IGAD of the conflict. So you have I think a regional organization right now that has no obvious leader, that is been hollowed out and does not have a strong organizational or bureaucratic structure to deal with this very complex conflict, in not just in Sudan, but in the Horn more broadly. I mean, when you look at all the things that are going on within the IGAD region, Ethiopia, Eritrea, the GERD, the Somaliland deal recognition, obviously the internal situation inside Somalia. I mean, and obviously then there's the Red Sea, instability that's going on. So there's a lot going on that is putting stress on the IGAD member states that I don't think the institution of IGAD is in a position right now to deal with in any real meaningful way. All of the member states are experiencing some instability, both internally and regionally right now, and I think that has really hollowed out what we can expect from IGAD going forward.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it does seem that it's quite a little bit bleak, the future of Sudan and the region. But Cameron, thank you for your very insightful views and comments. We really do appreciate your honoring our invitation and coming here. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's great to be on.
Thank you, viewers and listeners, for tuning in today, this week's episode. We've had an important guest, Cameron Hudson, and I hope you enjoyed the insightful comments from Cameron about South Sudan. I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to our platforms on YouTube and on Spotify for more updates and more episodes. Stay tuned, and I'll see you next week.